2014 marks the anniversary of World War I. Today's episode, Before the Silence, is based on the representation of war and conflict within the arts. Every day we see and read news stories and reports of international war and conflict. It has leaked into our cultural psyche, and as a result we have slowly become desensitized to images of war. In this episode, we will be exploring how sound can make us respond differently to conflict, and how what we hear and what we think we hear can be completely separate.
Hey, listen to my 9mm go back.
That was John Michael Turner stripping his medals and ribbons from his chest.
On April 18th, 2006, I had my first confirmed kill. This man was innocent. I don't know his name. I called him the Fat Man. He was walking back to his house, and I shot him in front of his friend and his father.
We barely understand the world around us. Why things are the way they are is a question that goes unanswered. My name is Baneen Mirza. I grew up in Karachi and I moved to London last year. This kind of question has followed me from home to here. Previous generations have spoken of a life in a balanced and liberal Pakistan. They never understand why life has come to this now, one filled with conflict and war. Neither do I. Target killing, kidnapping for ransom, and blasts are as common as anything else in life, like happiness, sorrow, and death. They can occur at random. You can only hope that the experiences you dread do not happen to you or anyone you hold dear. You just live out your life day to day. But even when it does happen to someone near and dear, you carry on, still living, with fear and hope. Every period of war has its own sound. Depending on the weapons used at the time, different soundscapes are created. The most recent being improvised explosive devices for Iraq, helicopters in Afghanistan, and now the all-pervasive sound of drones haunt the skies. This year, we commemorate the centenary of the First World War breakout. The sounds of artillery barrages, sirens, chain guns, and depth charges are associated with the 4 years of the war. But we can sometimes forget that sounds of everyday life also exist at a time of conflict. I've often questioned how war is perceived by the rest of the world. In Pakistan, we've had no break. The gunshots are like a lullaby to me, ears given to all the wrong sounds. We've had no time to reflect on war because it is happening somewhere in the country at this exact moment. Increasingly, artists and sound designers are using sound in response to war, but this is still a relatively unexplored area. In this program, I'm going to be talking to an artist, a sound designer, and a librettist to find out how they work sonically. Towards the end, James Taylor will be joining us from the Imperial War Museum to discuss the newly refurbished galleries and its updated soundscape experience.
I became interested in the legal space as an acoustic space because, of course, it's filled with many specific types of listening. It's called a hearing more often than not.
Everyday sounds include ourselves speaking to one another. But what happens when what you say can be held against you? And what happens when your voice is politicized? Lawrence Abu Hamdan is a London-based artist. Last year, he did a seminar on his project Oral Contract at the Tate Modern. His work explores the politics of listening and the relationship between sound and law, human rights and conflict through audiovisual installations. He specifically discussed his research on Språk, a Swedish linguistic company which forensically analyzes the voices of asylum seekers, as well as his other projects, when I met him at his studio in Tottenham Hale.
From there, that was really the kind of beginning of thinking about what the voice is and what the voice does and its kind of politics, because there it's really a place where speech acts. The more I went into that, the more I got interested in the more complex ways that voices are processed in that space from each of the different protagonists. The ways in which the witnesses' voices were being listened to, not only in the sense of what they say, but increasingly because of the voice being used as evidence in itself. if we take, for example, something like the oath,
You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
they become these like kind of white magic incantations where people kind of repeat them. They're said, and until they're said, only then can the kind of law be enacted. Only then can people be actually heard, right? The right to silence is also interesting because if we really think about it, what it means, it doesn't really function like a right to remain silent, but more one's kind of becoming aware that they are within of a space in which kind of listening is different. The conditions of listening have changed, right? So it's a kind of speech act issued by the police at the moment of one's arrest, which really places the voice into custody first and foremost, right? You've now crossed the threshold between kind of normal conversation and liable speech. Anything you say is kind of subject to another form of scrutinization. Throughout history, you see how phonemes become weaponized, sounds become weaponized within hunting for specific people, especially within civil conflicts where, of course, people look the same, right? In my documentary, The Freedom of Speech itself, there was a moment where a man is rejected as a Palestinian, as he claims, and told that he's Syrian because of the way he pronounced the word tomato. So he said bandura, and the word, the Syrian pronunciation, as they claim, is banadura. So there's this little sound. And this is the same sound that was used during the Lebanese civil war by the right-wing militias, Kataib and other kind of things. So in a way, whenever these kind of questions of voice emerge, it's not really a kind of new thing as well, but it's something that is kind of building on all of these kind of prejudices. It learns from these kind of prejudices from the ways in which a voice has been weaponized for millennia. Increasingly, I have to present my works in a gallery context. It poses another challenge, right? Because people aren't really used to kind of listening in a gallery, or still the gallery space is not really a good kind of listening space. So it kind of provokes you to kind of think again and to kind of retranslate the works for those contexts and to kind of position them. And each time you have a new medium, you question, well, what kind of listening happens in that space and how is that relevant to the kind of experience of the works. So that kind of way of looking at conflict is really important because it brings in these kind of other subjects into the historiography or something of events which have been kind of violently deleted. The kind of expedience of the image also means the kind of exclusion of a certain form of violence.
The most everyday sounds we all hear are the ones closest to us. Our own voices and accents are held against us. Every sound we make is liable to scrutiny. But how do we react to sounds fed to us through media and entertainment? And are we as consciously aware of them? Do we hear or do we listen to them? And how do they affect us? Stephen Barton is a British music composer who has written music for motion pictures, video games, and television. He's the master behind the video game score of Call of Duty Modern Warfare, which has sold 14 million copies to date. I managed to get hold of him online at his Los Angeles studio about his recent major project, the EA blockbuster video game Titanfall, and he tells us about the manipulative power of sound.
What we hear and what we think we hear are two very, very different things. You're trying to create something that's not just literal, you're trying to create something that's 10% beyond literal. With Titanfall, we have these two levels. So there's the level of the Titan's weaponry, which is much bigger, physically bigger. And then there's the pilots who are running around with basically, regular sized guns. And it's an interesting thing of like something that sounds bigger initially you'd think you would just turn the volume up, but funnily enough, that actually doesn't work. It doesn't even begin to work. You have to kind of come up with a sort of hyper reality. You have to come up with a sort of, what would this gun sound like if you scaled it up 200%, 500%, 1000%? It's got to be 110%, and reality rarely works. Like CNN now puts music under everything. I mean, there'll be music under sort of, here's the weather. Especially if it's sort of, a story about conflict, they're conditioning it as entertainment in a way. I mean, it's being sort of put out as not just sort of factual, but it's got to be more interesting than that because they fear people will turn off. What I found interesting about working on game sequels is that they always want to do something new. They never really want to rest on the laurels. They want to use what they've had, but gamers as a bunch seem to be very acutely aware of if you sort of voiced the same thing on them again. You look at the Call of Duties, and really, some of them are radically different to others. A lot of these games require you to be doing relatively repetitive things. Sort of running around, shoot. If it's exactly the same gun sound every time, the ear gets very, very quickly annoyed by it. It's actually really interesting, and you can't necessarily figure out why. We never hear sound exactly the same way twice. It's just not part of what we're accustomed to. And we're only, the third or fourth generation that sort of ever actually heard a time where these things existed. And in video game terms, with the first generation that's sort of grown up never knowing a world without video games. So the idea of like, why is music there? What are we trying to do with it? What's the point of it? Is an interesting one. And it is funny how you can change, and you quickly learn this as a film composer, you can change someone's emotional reaction to a scene. If you took Platoon and you took the Samuel Barber Adagio for strings out of that, it would be infinitely less impactful, despite the fact it's the exact same images, the exact same story, but somehow that would have a great deal less impact in terms of sort of, as a commentary on wars. The sound of the game is so loud. Every sound in the game is loud. You have the Titans, which are, every step is a loud sound. The guns are all loud. There's grenades going off. There's so much sound in there. If you have music that's incredibly complex, percussive, and you try and mix it with the sound, it just becomes this wall of explosions, gunfire, and what have you. We actually drop the music down, and the music level will duck down very, very subtly, very gently. And sometimes drop out altogether. I guess with the gunfire thing in Parkhouse, it's like you don't know whether the next sound is going to be more gunshots, an explosion, someone screaming. It's almost like the lack of information as humans. The lack of information is makes us want more. Once you give people information and then take it away, it creates this need for more. I often tell directors actually, sometimes the most important music cues are the ones we don't have. We'll often we'll take a music cue out of a film. We'll have especially over something that's either very emotional or very, very intense.
Stephen Barton reflected on the representation of conflict in entertainment. On the one hand, armies adopt tactics of shock and awe to weaken the morale of civilian populations by creating a climate of fear. On the other hand, fictional mediums like film and video games employ sound as a key stimulant in the reenactment of warlike environments. Following from Stephen, I met with Nick Drake, who's a British poet, screenwriter, and librettist. We talked about his current project for the English National Opera called Between Worlds. He's working in collaboration with a contemporary British composer Tansy Davis, and the Barbican's artistic associate Deborah Warner will be directing the opera. The piece is based on the events of 9/11, focusing on the relationships and emotions of the people affected. He works with sounds in response to conflict in a space that is neither entertainment or documentary. His work is an emotional and artistic response to a traumatic event.
We began to think about the ending of the tower as a possible subject for an opera, but of course it's a tremendously sensitive subject, so it took us a while to sort of to find our way into an approach to it that we felt comfortable with. We need to remember that this was real and that there are families, many, many families who suffered in this. That shouldn't be a preventative thought. In fact, it should become a kind of imperative for trying to make a piece of art that responds fully to the emotional reality of what happened. And also, I suppose I was encouraged by the fact that there are many documentaries about the destruction of the towers, and there are novels, and there has been one other opera about it. So it's not as if we're going into new, absolutely new territory. My way into it was when I discovered that WikiLeaks had released 500,000 pager messages from that day. And so they begin with very simple things like, what do you want for dinner? And I think I left the kettle on, and see you later. And they end with people saying, you made my life. You know, I love you. In the space of a very compressed period of what you might genuinely call dramatic time, people went from an ordinary day to the last day. And the reality and the simplicity of what they needed to communicate to each other became for me the kind of DNA for the writing of the libretto. It became the kind of, the genetic material out of which I felt that I could develop something. In the past, I've always thought, well, you know, what if the music's what it needs to be, why does it need words? And if the words are what they need to be in a poem, why would it ever need music? And I do still think that. But of course, what's fascinating about opera is that you're in a wrestling match with these things. And of course, for me, my priority is that the words should be exactly what I want them to be, and I've chosen all of them very, very carefully within the kind of given dramatic structures that I've also shaped. But what I'm discovering is that the music is really the thing that goes beyond where language ends. And because our piece is very much about going beyond where all language ends, it's something much more ineffable and complex. That seems to be sort of dramatized in the way that we're working. You know, my priority and my care is for my characters as well. But at a certain point you discover, of course, that very, very simple things in language can have tremendous complexity and power in their musical dimension. You know, I know from film writing that dialogue isn't just what's said, it's what's not said. It's the kind of resonance around what is said. It's silence, it's the beat, it's the pause, and all of the kind of, what should I say, all the kind of verbal palette of all of that is just as important to me in the writing as what's actually said, the words that actually end up on the page and their relationship to each other. But I think in a bigger sense, our opera does get to a point of absolute silence, where the silence is, I suppose, it's kind of the sense of absence where we can't go. My characters at a certain point become silent. It's really difficult. I mean, we're confronting ourselves with very, very complex things here about how art can depict these events of great suffering and what rights it has to do that, and where you have to be audacious, where you have to be respectful. But I don't know if it's about there being too much emotion. I think it's that perhaps there's a simplicity that is discovered, which actually steps beyond language at a certain point. Language will take you to a certain point, and then you step beyond it into something so simple it doesn't need language to express it. That's certainly something that happens with our characters in this.
Having spoken to these artists, it seems that silence is the unifying non-sound of all conflict. My last memory of silence immediately after the sound of a blast or gunshots in Karachi is of a silence loud with fear, flooded with haunting thoughts and questions. What just happened? Did someone die? Are we safe? Lawrence Abu Hamdan mentioned the right to silence and silence as a voice in itself, while Stephen Barton told us how silence or a pause are used in fictional representations of war to create a tension that is more threatening than sound itself. And for Nick Drake, silence is beyond language, beyond expression. Every year, wars are commemorated with a moment of silence. Since this year marks the centennial of the beginning of the First World War, I wanted to find out more about how the Imperial War Museum is going to use sound to help the public re-engage with British military history. James Taylor is the curator and head of the First World War galleries at the museum. He told me that one of the reasons for the remodeling was because it was becoming increasingly difficult for younger audiences to identify with the First World War. We spoke about the July opening of the refurbished galleries and discussed how and why the audio work included in the new exhibition is particularly important today. Tell us how sound is used in these new galleries and what are the changes that you're making to them?
I think, well, the way that we're using sound in the new First World War galleries, it varies. We are working with a firm called Idee und Klang in Basel to create a soundscape that changes as visitors go through the exhibition. I think it's very important to say that we're not trying to recreate conflict kind of orally, if you like, because if we were to try and replicate, say, the noise of a heavy artillery bombardment, we contravene health and safety regulations.
What kind of experience can visitors expect, and how are you using sound to do this?
What we're trying to do is create very much a kind of suggested environment to make people realise that they are somewhere else and are embedded within the story. So if I give you an example, when we come to the war as an event, beginning in August 1914, one of the things that we want to get across is the horrific casualties caused by massed modern quick-firing artillery. And this means mainly shrapnel, so that's shells that are fired overhead, they crack open, and they throw hundreds of lead balls down on men advancing in the open. And this is what goes on to cause trench warfare, because that's the sensible response, is to dig in. So in order to kind of get this across, we had a couple of difficulties. First of all, the horror of these kind of quick-firing guns and the shrapnel is not conveyed by photographs from the time. We actually don't either have the sound of shrapnel shells cracking in the air and the kind of horrible kind of banshee kind of shriek that they used to make, according to people who'd lived through them. So what we've done is to suggest that in our soundscape, and it's tied up to a projection which is kind of animated, showing men advancing and giving you an idea of what these hails of shrapnel did. So people just, so this shriek, and then they drop, basically. So that's one kind of created piece. There are other more kind of ambient spaces. So we've got an area called Deadlock, which looks at the kind of advent of trench warfare, the beginnings of that between late 1914 up to kind of 1916. And it's, for example, the sounds of digging, the muffled sounds of gunfire, the odd crack of rifles, suggested voices as well. And I say suggested, there's nothing you can pick out really that they're saying. We've got, again, in another piece where we're trying to show, you know, the huge bombardment before the Battle of the Somme, we have a massive 9.2-inch howitzer, so this really big gun. And we've got film of those guns firing, and again, it needs some kind of audio with it to give the impact, because these things don't fire silently. So again, it's that muffled thud that these things make as they are discharged.
How is the sonic experience different from the previous galleries?
There wasn't really a strategic idea of a soundscape at all in them. I think if you saw, I mean, you've got to bear in mind these were created in the late 1980s, so they were very much of their time. And they included things like, you know, the noise of guns. It was very documentary, the kind of thing you'd see if you watched The World at War or something. This is a very, very different approach, and it's meant to help people kind of immerse themselves in the story as they go through.
You mentioned the trenches before. What are the sounds inside the trenches trying to communicate?
What we want to get across is that men are not in the front line all the time. In fact, they're not in the front line most of the time, although they are exposed to danger. What they're doing an awful lot more is kind of labouring, digging, moving supplies and things like that. So we've taken a kind of notional communications trench going up to the front line with men moving things, talking. There is audio in here, but it's incidental, if you like. You don't have to follow some kind of narrative. People will have already seen that there's a lot of death and destruction, but there's another element to this war, which is being out in the open for so long, whatever the weather. And so, for example, we put in, there's a rainstorm starts, during this soundscape in the trench. And so it's just to get people to think, well, actually, you're stuck in this space and all you can see is the strip of sky above you and you're having rain pouring down on you and you've got nowhere to go. You've just got to stay there. And I think that kind of experience is really critical to get across to people as well. And I think kind of certainly, the idea, the whole thing with soundscapes has moved on hugely. And we realise now how important they are to the whole gallery space.
How will the new galleries change our perception of people's experiences of the First World War?
There are experiences which go beyond suffering. Some people have a great time. And they say that, we don't think of the First World War as, nobody ever smiled. It was the most dreadful experience for everybody all the time through those 4 years. If you look at a lot of the diaries and letters, it's just not the case. You've got a lot of these young men are going out, getting paid, going abroad for the first time, being properly fed for the first time. And I think that if we can open our eyes that this experience is a much more nuanced one than people had actually thought. Yes, of course, there's immense suffering there as well. But these people often form kind of comradeships and friendships which last them for life and find a love, say, for example, in the trenches that they never find anywhere else again.
And now I'd like to introduce Brian Dillon, who's a writer and critic and UK editor of Cabinet magazine. He has recently completed curating the exhibition Ruin Lust at Tate Britain, and he's currently researching the sound of explosions and what he calls their acoustic shadows, and will now read a short essay called The Island is Full of Noises.
The most celebrated historical instance of the phenomenon known as an acoustic shadow occurred on the afternoon of the 1st of February 1901. Queen Victoria, having died a week earlier on the Isle of Wight, her body was being conveyed to Portsmouth aboard the royal yacht HMS Alberta. As the vessel and its convoy headed east in the Solent, a line of some 30 warships drew up and began to fire their 6-inch guns at intervals of a minute by way of salute. In the days that followed, newspapers in London and around the country received letters claiming a remarkable sonic event. The firing had been heard well over 100 miles away, in Cambridge, at St Ives, and near Woodbridge in Suffolk. But on the south coast, not a rumble was reported, and many who turned out to hear the cannonade in Winchester, Bournemouth, or Chichester had gone home disappointed. This remarkable story quickly entered the annals of acoustical research. In time, however, the original incident was haloed with apocrypha. It became common in popular literature on acoustics to ascribe the strange effects to guns fired in London a few days later during Victoria's funeral, or at Windsor where the funeral actually took place, and even to assert that the sound had been heard in Scotland. But the incident had a more profound afterlife during the First World War, when it was cited by comparison with sound and blast waves from field artillery and high explosives. The war afforded ample and grisly opportunity to study the behaviour of energy at a distance, and it was frequently found that sound and shock waves behaved capriciously, their force being unpredictable in terms of distance from the seat of an explosion or a fusillade. The scientific literature of the war is thus full of instances of explosions heard and people killed at quite unexpected distances. The eccentricity of sound in the Solent in 1901 may be explained by a sonic curiosity that is the projective auditory equivalent of a mirage or fata morgana. Acoustic shadows can usually be traced to one or more of 3 causes. First, absorption. The sound is muffled for a time by intervening soil or forest or snow, but is heard further away on solid or open ground. Second, wind direction. Sounds are more likely to be heard downwind than upwind. Third, and most complex, is temperature inversion. The air turns warmer above ground than near it, causing sound waves to bend back towards the earth. In certain cases, rings of audibility will radiate from the source as sound is refracted upwards and then down again. This is why one may find oneself many miles from the action, but hearing it clearly or still subject to its shuddering effects, while those closer to the centre remain oblivious.
I'd like to thank Lawrence Abu Hamdan, Stephen Barton,